Going to be looking at prophecy today, at the topic of the third temple. Those of you who've been to Israel, to the shrine of the book, will recognize that's a model of the first century Jerusalem there, in as much accurate detail as historians are able to give. That obviously zooming in on there is the temple that was in Jesus' day. And if we look at biblical prophecy, we notice repeated allusions to the temple. Jesus speaks about the temple, so does Paul, so does John, and so does Daniel and Ezekiel. So they continually talk about the temple in the end times, but there is no temple at the moment. Jesus, for example, tells the Jews, and we believe he's referring to the end time generation of Jews, that when you see standing in the holy place, that's a reference to the temple. The abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel. Let the reader understand, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. How can people see an abomination in a building that isn't there? So one of the signs that we are looking for with the second coming of Jesus is the rebuilding of the temple. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that that has to be done before the rapture, because buildings can be put up very quickly nowadays. It's quite possible it's built after the rapture. But the point is, we've seen events that are leading to the rebuilding of a Jewish temple. If you are interested in this and you want more detail, I've got a book that goes into a lot of detail, but yes, this is the easy version of the book. And so we believe that there's going to be a third Jewish temple that will be built in Jerusalem. Remember, Solomon built the first temple to replace the tabernacle. It was rebuilt. We know after the destruction by the Babylonians, 70 years later, it was rebuilt. And in the time of Jesus, it had been refurbished by Herod. And that was that second temple that stood in the time of Jesus. And so if you look at Bible prophecy, you'll find that it speaks of a world ruler, a political ruler that is referred to as the Antichrist, if you read John's epistles. They're referred to as the beast, if you read the book of Revelation, and the man of lawlessness in 1 Thessalonians. The early church writers all identified those terms as referring to one person, not an organization, as some people try to say, or a system, a person. And we know that he will exercise power for a 7-year period that we call the tribulation, absolute power for half of that period, the second half. And initially, the first 3.5 years, he will be a hero to all. He won't seem like a bad guy. Revelation 13 verse 3 says that the whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. They were amazed at him, this political ruler. Why are they amazed at him? Well, for one, we believe that he's going to broker a 7-year peace treaty with Israel as one of the parties. Now, those sort of prophecies aren't explicitly laid out, but we can, through fair, reasonable deduction, come to that conclusion. Daniel 9 verse 27, speaking of this end-time prince, a Roman prince. That's why we believe he'll come out of, the former Roman Empire, and says that he will confirm a covenant with many for 1/7. So, a treaty. And the most likely treaty is a peace treaty in the Middle East. Why do we believe that? Well, there's a lot of problems in the Middle East between Israel and her neighbors. And we are told that there'll be this expectation of peace in the end times. So in that context, speaking about, the man of lawlessness and speaking about the coming of the Lord, Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 5, 2-3, you know very well that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night when people are saying, peace and safety. Now, certainly at the moment, we are in a war-torn world. In fact, Jesus said that wars and rumors of wars would be a sign leading to his coming. But here, there's going to be an expectation of peace. So the implication is that this superhero politician brings peace to the world and to the Middle East in particular. And so that's why it's a very plausible option that this is a reference to a Middle East treaty. We know that the US and the European powers are forever trying to broker peace treaties in the Middle East, because conflict there often spreads to the rest of the world, sometimes in the form of radical terrorism. And it was just the most recent one was brokered by Jared Kushner, shown over there, was the son-in-law of Trump. And there was a lot of excitement among people who follow prophecy then, given the fact that Jared Kushner is a Jew. And unfortunately, the Palestinians didn't want to take part in that. But we believe that the 7-year tribulation, based on what we know of prophecy, is going to start with the signing of a 7-year Middle East peace treaty by this politician the Bible calls the beast, the Antichrist. However, midterm, Daniel says that that treaty will be broken. He will confirm a covenant with many. He says for 1/7, but he goes on to say in the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. Now again, that's referring to sacrifices that are made in the temple. It's not only no temple, there's no sacrifices today. So in order for the Antichrist to stop sacrifice, they have to be reinstituted. 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 2-3, Paul says this about this man of lawlessness: the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night, when people are saying peace and safety. Destruction will come on them suddenly as labor pains on a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. He breaks this treaty midterm. And Paul tells us that this abomination that Jesus spoke of, that Daniel spoke of, is equated with this man proclaiming himself to be God in the temple. So the temple has to be there. He tells the Thessalonians, who had been taught by some heretics that the day of the Lord had already come. So they even had preterists in those days. And Paul says that you must not become easily unsettled or alarmed by some prophecy, report, or letter supposed to have come from us, saying that the day of the Lord has already come. Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until the rebellion, or that's the apostasy, occurs. And the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man doomed to destruction. He will oppose and exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. God's temple, that's the temple in Jerusalem, which isn't there. And John seems to be speaking of that same event that Paul speaks of and that Jesus and Daniel refer to when he speaks of the beast. In Revelation 13, speaking of the second beast, who is the false prophet, the sidekick of the Antichrist, says that he ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast, that's the first beast, the Antichrist, who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. So it appears he survived some sort of assassination attempt. He was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast so that it could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. Abomination that will be set up in the temple. So the Antichrist is a political ruler. The false prophet is a religious leader. And the Jews who generally reject Jesus, there are Messianic Jews who accept Jesus as a Messiah, but the majority of Jews who reject Jesus will regard either the Antichrist or the false prophet as the Messiah, because Jesus said, I have come in my Father's name and you do not accept me, but if someone else comes in his own name, you will accept him. Already Irenaeus, as I've told you before, the second generation disciple of John, applied that verse to the Antichrist. Jesus said, speaking of this time, this tribulation, there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. And then he says, at that time, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Messiah, or there he is, do not believe it. So Jesus spoke of a false Messiah as well. Now, Orthodox Jewish scholars and the rabbinic authorities generally believe that the temple will be rebuilt, but that it's going to occur in the era of the Jewish Messiah, Remember, they reject Jesus. They believe the Messiah is still coming, and they believe that when he comes, the temple will be rebuilt. Hippolytus, one of the early Christian writers, believed that the Antichrist would build the temple in order to curry favor with the Jews. This is what he says. After that, he will build the temple in Jerusalem and will restore it again speedily and give it over to the Jews. So we see these early writers. Again, Hippolytus was a disciple of Irenaeus. These early writers who were influenced by the teachings of John believed the Antichrist was a physical person and that the temple in Jerusalem would be rebuilt. People try and make up these are recent doctrines. They're not. They're the original teaching of the church. And because of the fact that the Jews are looking for a Messiah and the temple to be rebuilt, it seems very likely, once again, it's not explicitly said, that the Antichrist may be the sponsor of the building of the temple. Remember, the temple needs to be rebuilt. Now, why is there no temple anymore? Well, if you read Matthew 24 and Luke 21, Jesus predicted the temple's destruction. The temple was standing in his days, and he said to his disciples who were marveling about this beautiful building that Herod had renovated, despite the fact that he was a terrible person, he was a great builder, building things like Masada, the Masada fortress, and this second temple. And Jesus said to them, do you see all these things? I tell you the truth, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. And those words of his were fulfilled about 40 years after he said them. When Titus, a Roman military commander, because of a revolt that was occurring in Judea, went there with his armies, and eventually these zealots fled to Jerusalem, and they not only destroyed Jerusalem, they destroyed the temple. We've got some Muslims today who try to deny that there is a temple because they've got a holy mosque on that site, and they claim that there was no temple. Well, that's very strange, because we have not only the Jewish writers, we have pagan writers and Christian writers all speaking about the Romans destroying this temple that allegedly they say was never there. And not only that, you can see up there, that's in Rome today. They call it the Arch of Titus, which shows Titus coming back from Jerusalem. And you see they've got the menorah from this temple that allegedly, we are told by these temple deniers, never was there. These are the same guys who deny the Holocaust. So in the early 2nd century, there were Messianic groups who thought that the temple would be rebuilt, because they took Jeremiah's prophecy about, the restoration in 70 years, and that had been fulfilled with the first temple, and they thought it was going to happen again. And so because it was about 70 years after the destruction of the temple, they were lobbying to rebuild the temple. And Emperor Hadrian cruelly dashed their hopes. This man hated the Jews, and he not only dashed their hopes, he built a new Roman city on the ruins of Jerusalem when he crushed this revolt that they had. And he even changed the name. He called it Aelia Capitolina. And this revolt was led by a Messianic figure, this guy called Bar Kokhba. That's the Jews there saw as a Messiah trying to rebuild the temple. And as I say, they were crushed by the Romans, even though they gave them a pretty hard time at first. And eventually in AD 135, they were defeated, and some 580,000 Jews were killed. But Hadrian not only erected this new city over Jerusalem, he actually put a pagan temple on top of the site of the temple, just to spite them. It was a temple dedicated to Jupiter, Jupiter Capitolinus. And he tried to erase the memory of Judea, and he renamed the province to Syria Palestinia. It was never called that before. Palestine is not a biblical name. It actually was chosen deliberately to spite the Jews. He named it after their enemies, the Philistines. So the term Palestine is not a term that's endeared by people who are lovers of Israel. It's associated with their enemies. And Constantine, the first Christian emperor, not only renamed Aelia Capitolina back to Jerusalem, even though, once again, we don't know this explicitly, it seems very likely that he destroyed that temple. We know that he sent his mother to Jerusalem and she built a lot of churches, that some of which are still standing today, although they have been rebuilt over the centuries. And it seems that he actually knocked down this temple that had been built by Hadrian, and he changed the name back to Jerusalem. So despite the fact that people vilify Constantine, we see how he loved the city of Jerusalem. He had a nephew, though, and this was the last pagan emperor of Rome. And he was brought up as a Christian, but he rebelled and he became known as Julian the Apostate. And so, because of his opposition to Christianity, he actually gave permission to the Jews to rebuild their temple. And he even supplied the necessary funds. And so Jews from all over, were coming back to rebuild this temple with the assistance of the pagan emperor, the last pagan emperor. Their efforts were destroyed by fearful balls of fire. Now, the reason I put this excerpt in here, it's related by Christian historians as well, but people always dismiss it because if it comes from a Christian source, it can't be accurate. According to modern historians, this is actually from a pagan who was a friend of Julian. This is what he wrote. He said that when they started to rebuild the temple, fearful balls of fire breaking out near the foundations continued their attacks till the workmen, after repeated scorchings, could approach no more, and he, that's the architect, gave up the attempt. Okay, now people have theorized as to what have caused this, subterranean gases, and they've come up with naturalistic explanations. The Christians at the time believed that it was a judgment of God. But within a year, Julian was killed in his 30s while he was retreating in battle, and this temple project again was abandoned. So still no temple. In AD 637, the Muslims captured this area in the Middle East. They captured Jerusalem. They took it from the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire was the Roman Empire's new name under Constantine. It moved from Rome to Constantinople, which was known as Byzantium. And so we call the Christian Roman Empire the Byzantine Empire. But eventually it fell to the Muslims. And on that temple site, we don't know exactly when, there's different traditions. They built two mosques. The one at the top is referred to as the Dome of the Rock, that was built on the north. And the one in the southern part is called Al-Aqsa. So those two mosques today stand on what used to be the temple site. So the temple's destroyed, temple to Jupiter built by Hadrian, probably knocked down by Constantine. Julian tries to get the Jews to rebuild the temples, unsuccessful. The Muslims come along and they build mosques on the site. And those mosques still stand today. And for centuries, Christians were allowed to visit the temple site, but eventually there was violence against these pilgrims to Jerusalem, and that's what instigated the Crusades. There's a lot of a revisionist history that's written about the Crusaders, and while they weren't angels, most of what we read is rubbish. The same about the Knights Templar. There's so many conspiracy theories about them which have absolutely no basis in fact. But the Knights Templar set up their headquarters in Al-Aqsa, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the Dome of the Rock was converted into a church by the Augustinians during the time of the Crusaders. Just trying to give you a bit of a brief history of that site. One thing you'll notice is there was never a period in this history ever when Israel belonged to a group of people called the Palestinians. So giving Israel back to the Palestinians is a misnomer because it never belonged to a group called the Palestinians, and the very name came from the Romans, the pagan Romans who were trying to spite the Jews. And about a century after the Crusaders' arrival, Saladin, who was a Sunni Muslim, took the city of Jerusalem, very well known, and the Dome of the Rock was reconsecrated as a Muslim shrine, took the cross off in the top of the dome, and they put an Islamic crescent there. And Al-Aqsa Mosque was restored to its function as a mosque. That's the remains of Richard the Lionhearted, he's called. He was a very successful crusader from Britain, and he inflicted major damage to Saladin's armies everywhere. But one of the things he didn't do is retake Jerusalem. However, they had a bit of a mutual respect, Saladin and Richard, and so they came to an agreement where they ceased fighting, but Saladin agreed that Christians could once again come to Jerusalem as pilgrims. 1517, the area fell into the control of the Ottoman Empire, also Muslims. They conquered Jerusalem and the rest of Palestine. They took it from the Mamluks, who were another Muslim group as well. So I've skipped some of the story here. If you want the full story, if you like the history, you can get the book. They prohibited non-Muslims from setting foot on the Temple Mount until the early 19th century, where then again non-Muslims were allowed to visit the city. And they'll tell you today that they highly revered the Temple Mount, but that's one of the pictures we have during the Ottoman period, which shows the neglect of the Temple Mount. It wasn't well looked after. Jerusalem wasn't really regarded as important, and until it became politically expedient in the 20th century to suddenly make out that it was very important to Muslims. World War I. The Ottoman Turks were allies of Germany. And so, if you know your history, the Germans and the Turks were defeated by the Allies. And the British took Jerusalem. There's a picture of General Allenby, who's entering Jerusalem. He entered it on foot. He was riding a horse, but out of respect, because Jesus came in on a donkey, he came in on foot. And we had the period that started, which we call the British Mandate. And what they decided to do was to split the Ottoman Empire. And that's where you got the countries like Iran and Iraq coming into being, because they didn't exist before, in Turkey. Now, what had happened during the war, the British, different people in the British had promised what is called Palestine to two different groups of people. And so it was promised to the Arabs, you know, if they would help them against the Turks, which they did, by Henry McMahon. But at the same time, the Balfour Declaration explicitly promised the area to the Jews, also for their assistance. So the Jews and the Arabs were promised the same area. Well, not really. The Jews were explicitly promised the area we know as Israel. The promise to the Arabs was very generic. And so to temporarily solve the issue, they decided they wouldn't give it to either, but that the French and the British would, you know, supervise that territory. And so we had the British Mandate. The French looked over Syria and the British looked over that area. And eventually that part that you see to the east was given to the Arabs because of that treaty. So the Arabs were already given territory. We call that territory Jordan. And so remember, they promised the Jews and the Arabs territory there. They gave that larger territory to the Arabs. So if people tell you that the Palestinians need a homeland, there is one already. It's called Jordan. But they wanted everything. They wanted what was Israel as well. And so the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, he was a religious leader. He used the wall, that's the Western Wall, as a focal point for anti-Zionist campaigns. That's, you know, Zionists are people who wanted Israel to become a nation again. He incited Muslims. He proclaimed the Western Wall, which is the last retaining wall of the temple, as a holy Muslim site. So all of a sudden, a site that's been neglected for years becomes very important to Islam. And they incited riots, and they claimed that Jewish prayer endangered the mosques that were holy to Islam. And in 1948, after the Second World War, Israel, by a very close vote, and it was mainly due to support from the United States, became a nation again. And we had all the Arab nations converging on them and fighting against them. And this fledgling nation still managed to defeat, against all odds, these people who were coming against them, and the state of Israel was born. However, they didn't get control of the old part of Jerusalem. That old part of Jerusalem fell to the Jordanians, and it was administered by the Jordanians. And while Jordan had control of the old city of Jerusalem where the temple was, Jewish holy places were desecrated, vandalized, and destroyed. Christian churches were prohibited from buying property in Jerusalem. Christian religious organizations were restricted from owning property near holy places. So that's the freedom of religion we had then. But in 1967, and this is why the Six-Day War is so important in prophecy, the Jews not only quadrupled their territory, they defeated again, fighting on 3 different fronts. In 6 days, they won this war, and part of what they took back was the old part of Jerusalem. And there we can see these parabats who were part of the group that retook Jerusalem, standing at the Temple Mount, the Western Wall. Jesus said, they will fall by the sword and be taken as prisoners to all nations. When you're speaking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So Jesus not only prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem, he said that Jerusalem would be trodden on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. The time of the Gentiles is the age that we living in, and we can see we are living in borrowed time, because already Jerusalem is no longer trampled by the Gentiles, even though the Temple Mount is. So we're certainly living in the end days. Jesus foresaw the church age where the whole world had the gospel preached to them. He said this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world. That's the age we're living, as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. And what will signal the end time? He said, Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And so, for people who try to say that God has nothing more to do with Israel and that the church has replaced Israel, well, there's a big problem in that all these prophecies which show that God still remembers his covenant to Israel, and the prophecies made by Jesus about Jerusalem once again falling into the hands of the Jews, the holy city. And so we believe, based on prophecy, that there's going to be a temple. The temple has to be rebuilt, and that temple is going to be defiled by the Antichrist. When the Jews retook the city for the sake of political correctness, what they did is they let the Muslims still administer the Temple Mount. So it's still administered by a Muslim body. And they did it as a gesture of peace, not that it got them any thanks. But there has to be a temple that is rebuilt. And there's 4 obstacles that stand in the way of these prophecies being fulfilled that we've been reading about. There's no Jewish temple in Jerusalem. The Muslims control the Temple Mount. They're not very likely to allow a temple to be rebuilt there. There's no sacrificial system in place. The Antichrist has to stop the sacrifices. They haven't started. And then also the 10th red heifer. So we're just going to quickly go through these points. So the remaining obstacles. The first one is there's no Jewish temple in Jerusalem. We need a Jewish temple to be rebuilt so that there can be sacrifices and so that ultimately the Antichrist can defile it. Also, the Jews link that to the coming of the Messiah, and hence the reason why the Antichrist or the false prophet is seen as being the Messiah. And the majority of Jews, according to polls I've taken, want the temple to be rebuilt. There's considerable doubt as to where the temple originally was, because it was destroyed by the Romans and they built a temple on top of it, and then the Muslims have built mosques on top of that site, and it would be easy to settle the debate by some archaeological work, but it's not allowed by the Muslims who administer the mountain. for obvious reasons. They deny that there was a temple there. And so I'm not going to go into this today. I've been through it before. And again, as I say, if you want to see the detail, there's different theories. Some people believe the temple was under the Dome of the Rock, and so that the Dome of the Rock has to be knocked down for the temple to be rebuilt. And there's theories that it might have been to the north of it, to the south of it. I personally believe in the southern hypothesis, and there's quite a lot of detail as to why I believe it, and I'm not going to go into that now. But I'll mention one thing. I don't believe that the Dome of the Rock will be knocked down, because if the Antichrist is a world leader who brings peace, you're going to seriously aggravate 1.5 billion Muslims if you knock down the Dome of the Rock and put a Jewish temple in that place. So it makes a lot more sense that it will be built next to it. And we find that there's reference in the book of Ezekiel near the temple, what is called the profane place. So when Ezekiel is told to measure this end time temple, it says he measured it by the four sides. It had a wall around about, and it goes on, and it says to make a separation between the sanctuary and the profane place. He speaks about the temple being next to a profane place. And I believe that that's a reference to the temple being built next to the Dome of the Rock, as opposed to the dome being knocked down. Master politician is going to try to keep everybody happy. He will want the Jews to be happy, and he will want the Arab Muslims to be happy. And if you look at the southern hypothesis, that will show that the temple, you can see there, actually sits between the dome and Al-Aqsa. If it's rebuilt in its original place, you wouldn't have to knock either of the mosques down. And in Revelation 11, John was given a reed like a measuring rod and told, go and measure the temple of God and the altar and count the worshippers, but exclude the outer court. Why? Because it had been given to the Gentiles. And so you can see there, the outer court there would be where Al-Aqsa falls. No Jewish temple. The Muslims control the mountain. And so, as I mentioned, when they liberated Jerusalem in 1967, for the first time in millennia, the Jews had control of the Temple Mount, and there were some 200,000 Jews who flocked to the Western Wall, the last remaining wall, not of the temple, but the retaining wall of the temple. That's why it's considered so holy today, and they go pray at the Western Wall. But Moshe Dayan, who was the Israeli Minister of Defense, told the soldiers to remove the Israeli flag, which they'd hoisted over the Dome of the Rock. And the Prime Minister, Levi Eshel, turned control over to the Jordanian Islamic Waqf, which is obviously, as the name implies, a Muslim organization. And as a gesture of peace, he gave them control over the mountain, the Temple Mount. And so, in order to keep the status quo, the Israeli government still enforces a very controversial ban on prayer. And so from time to time, you'll hear about some Jews getting arrested because they tried to pray on the Temple Mount. And you can access the Temple Mount by 11 gates, but tourists and non-Muslims are only allowed through that bridge that showed there, the Mughrabi Bridge, which is next to the Western Wall. There's the Western Wall to the left of it. And there's big signs there telling you that you're not allowed to engage in any religious activity if you go into that area, not allowed to pray. And so the Muslims have invented a revisionist history about the mountain and Jerusalem and how important it is to Islam. But interestingly, Jerusalem's never mentioned once in the Quran, but it's mentioned thousands of times in the Bible, in both the Old and the New Testament, not once in the Quran. And they take some obscure reference in their writings where it says that Muhammad went from Mecca to the furthest mosque, and they claim that that's one of the mosques in Jerusalem, even though, once again, if you go back in history, you'll find that earlier Muslims gave a totally different story as to what that referred to. And they will tell you that Muhammad visited that mosque on his winged horse, and he actually tied it at the Western Wall, amazingly. That's why the Western Wall is so important to them all of a sudden. And based on that bizarre story, they claim that the Temple Mount is important to the Muslims. The trip that Muhammad supposedly took to the mosque, which is Al-Aqsa in their opinion, is quite interesting because at the time he took the trip, Al-Aqsa hadn't been built yet. But, you know, it would only be built 10 years after that. But apparently Muhammad on his winged horse visited this mosque that would only be built 10 years later. And even if there was this mythical creature, this winged horse, well, the mosque wasn't even there to visit. But as I say, conveniently, they don't allow archaeological surveys because it would invalidate their claims. And instead, they'll try to tell you, you know, defying all the historical documents that we got and all the artifacts that they still find, that there actually wasn't a Jewish temple in that area, just like there wasn't a Holocaust. And another thing that they've done is they're trying to bolster their claim to the Mount by putting more mosques up there. So in an area that used to be known as Solomon's Stables, it used to be an area that you could visit. I remember when my sister Michelle went to Jerusalem years ago, she visited Solomon's Stables. Well, today it's been changed into a mosque. They claimed that they needed it for extra worship area. And in 1996, this Muslim body that administers the mountains issued a permit that they could use this as an alternative place of worship on the pretext that the occasional rainy days in Ramadan, they couldn't house all the people there. And later on, they declared that it was going to create a mosque for 10,000 worshippers, making it the largest mosque in the country because they want to strengthen their claim to this mountain. And they started doing a whole lot of excavations there, caused a whole lot of structural damage. And it's believed to actually have caused a large bulge that we see now in the southern wall. And it's, you know, threatened the structural integrity of the Temple Mount. And that's the area there, this mosque that used to be Solomon's Stables, now also be converted into a mosque. And so it goes without saying that in order to have the temple rebuilt, because the Muslims have created this false narrative about how important Jerusalem and the Temple Mount is to Islam, Antichrist will have to be a master politician because he's going to somehow have to come up with an agreement that will keep both the Muslims happy and the Jews happy. Not an easy thing to do. Many have tried and failed. The next thing is that there's no sacrificial system in place. Daniel speaks in chapter 9, verse 27, and he says, in the middle of the seven, remember that's the 7-year treaty, that's this prince that is to come, will put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation. So he not only sets up this abomination, he stops the sacrifice. Daniel 11 says, after coming to an agreement with him, he will act deceitfully. And with only a few people, he will rise to power. His armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. And so we need a sacrificial system. The Jews, even the religious Jews, don't want to reinstitute it until they've got another temple, because you need the temple for the sacrifices. Now, obviously, as Christians, we believe that sacrifice, animal sacrifice, is no longer necessary because Jesus came as the Lamb of God who took away the sin of the world. But remember, they don't view Jesus as the Messiah, so in their minds, they need to reinstitute sacrifice in the temple. And this comes from a Jewish website. It says, when the Messiah comes, the holy temple will be rebuilt. And once again, we will bring sacrifices on the holy altar there, as it says, and the sacrificial offerings of Judah and Jerusalem will be pleasing to Hashem. Hashem is the Lord, like in the olden days years ago, Malachi 3:4. They want the sacrifices and the temple. Now, Jesus brought in this period, the church age, we call it the dispensation of grace. And remember, the time of the Gentiles is an equivalent term as well. And we believe that ultimately it will end with the rapture of the church. We already see that Jerusalem has gone back to the Jews. But in our viewpoint, we believe that God will restore Israel. He's promised that in Romans 11. Israel has not been forgotten. Your covenant is not done away with. We also see in the book of Ezekiel that there's been prophesied a restoration, a twofold restoration of Israel. Remember, he prophesies to the dry bones and they come together, but there's no life in them. And he's told to prophesy a second time and they come to life. So we believe that the initial prophesying is being fulfilled today. Israel has become a nation again, but they're spiritually dead. But it's in this 7-year period that Israel is restored. This false Messiah, in the middle of the tribulation, they realize what he is when he sets up an image, because the Torah tells them that you mustn't bow down to a graven image. And there are Jews who believe that they need to wait for the Messiah to come, for the temple to be rebuilt. There's others who believe that they should use whatever opportunity they have to start doing the preparation. And one of those very prominent organizations is called the Temple Institute. And if you go look at their website, you'll see that they've actually reconstructed many of the vessels that are required for the sacrifices already. And this is from their website. Just as Moses used Bezalel, a master craftsman chosen by God to oversee the task of the construction of the vessels and the priestly garments for the synagogue, the Temple Institute has likewise called upon Israel's finest craftsmen and artisans to recreate the sacred vessels and vestments. They've already made the instruments and the vestments. And these are just some photos from their website. There we can see the stone altar that they've built. They've deliberately built it in such a way that it can be relocated to the temple when it's rebuilt. According to the Temple Institute, the people of Israel are required to build an altar exclusively on the site of the original altar on Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount. When circumstances become favorable, this new altar can be quickly reassembled on the proper location, enabling the divine service to be resumed without delay. They've already got the altar and all the instruments. And they've followed the instructions in the Torah where you're not allowed to use hewn stones in an altar. And there, once again, just from a different perspective, you can see some of the instruments, and these have all been manufactured or sponsored by the Temple Institute. What about the priests? You need priests to offer sacrifices. Do they know who the priests are? Well, despite the fact that they don't have the records to show which tribe they are, they know the Levitical tribe. The Orthodox and the conservative Jews still acknowledge that in Israel you have the Leviim, the Kohanim, and the Yisraelim. Leviim, people who've got the surname, well, we'd say Levi, it's Levi, means that they come from the tribe of Levi. And they were the Jews who used to perform religious administrative duties. They know them. But they know the priesthood tribe as well. And if someone's got the surname Cohen, because in Hebrew, Cohen is a priest. So you know anyone whose surname is Cohen, they're eligible to become a priest. And the rest, they call them Yisraelim. So they know the tribe of Levi and the Cohens, the priest. And so they're in training. And there's just one Rabbi, Shlomo Rishkin, a Cohen himself, gets measured for his garments. They make him the garments as well. As I say, if you want more information besides reading the book, or if you want to fact check, you can go check at the Temple Institute website. So the last one I want to mention is the red heifer. There's a lot said about this, and some people aren't too sure, well, what is this all about? Well, if you look in the Bible, the red heifer was used by the priests as a sacrifice, and initially it was used for the ritual purification of an Israelite who had come into contact with a corpse. So in Numbers 19 verse 2, this is a requirement of the law that the Lord has commanded. Tell the Israelites to bring you a red heifer without defect or blemish, and that has never been under a yoke. Now, if you don't know, a heifer is a young female cow who's never born a calf. And according to Numbers 19, it has to be red in color. Now, when it says red, it's not red, bright red as you think of it. It's like a brownish red. And according to Jewish tradition, there's been 9 red heifers during their history, which have been used to purify the temple. So, for example, when Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the temple and set up the image of Zeus in the temple, if you know your history about the Maccabees, when they purified the temple, they used the red heifer. Maimonides is one of the greatest medieval Jewish scholars, stated that the 10th red heifer will be accomplished by the king, the Messiah. So again, this link to the temple, which has to be dedicated through the ashes of a red heifer, and the link to the Messiah, according to this medieval Jewish scholar. And so, although, as I said, some people believe they should wait for the Messiah to build the temple, Maimonides believed that whenever they got the opportunity, they should do it. And that's why you've got these organizations already doing this. And so many religious Jews see the red heifer as a prerequisite. So they've not only got all their garments ready, all their instruments ready, made them portable so they can move them into the Temple Mount, they are actively looking for the 10th red heifer. And it's elusive because the requirements are very specific. If they find, I think it's more than 2 black hairs, it's disqualified. I think it has to be about, 2 or 3 years old. So the rabbis come and inspect and find a 3rd black hair, it's out. So there've been a lot of, news articles over the last couple of decades where they believe they've got the red heifer, and then unfortunately it grows a few black hairs and disqualifies itself. And this is from the Temple Institute website. They say the fate of the entire world depends on the red heifer, for God has ordained that its ashes alone are the single missing ingredient for the reinstatement of biblical purity and thereafter the rebuilding of the Holy Temple. We see prophecy coming to fulfillment. These last remaining prophecies are falling into place, everything put in place. One of the breeds that they believe might be the red heifer is a breed called the Red Angus, which has been bred in the United States. And I know there were a couple of red Angus cows that were sent through about 10 or 20 years ago. And unfortunately, they were also disqualified. But recently, and I want to end with this short clip, there've been another batch of these red cows that have been shipped into Israel from America, from Christian cattle farmers, in the hope that they're going to be able to get the elusive red heifer.